The wind came first. It always did. A low, cutting scream off the ridgeline that hit exposed skin like shards of broken glass and drove straight down through every layer of wool and cotton and field jacket a man could pile on his body. The temperature that night was 31 degrees below 0 Celsius. Not the kind of cold you read about in a weather report. The kind that turns motor oil into paste, cracks rifle stocks, and makes a man's lungs feel like he's breathing through wet concrete. The kind of cold that had been killing soldiers in that frozen peninsula for months before a single Chinese bugle ever split the darkness. And it was that cold, more than anything else, that set the conditions for what was about to happen on that hillside. Because when the Chinese came, and they came in numbers that defied rational military calculation, the machines that American soldiers depended on to stay alive had already begun to fail. Bolts were sluggish. Grease had congealed into something closer to wax, and the men whose job it was to hold the line had been awake for so long, burning so many calories just trying to generate enough body heat to keep their fingers functional, that the physical reserves they would need in the next few hours were already running dangerously low before the first shot was ever fired. This is not a story about a battle that appears in most history books. It is not Chosin Reservoir, though the ghosts of that campaign hang over every frozen ridge in this account. It is not Pork Chop Hill, though the logic of that grinding attrition warfare is present in every decision that gets made here. This is a story about a patrol, a small one, the kind of patrol the army sent out hundreds of times during the static phase of the Korean War, when the front lines had stabilized into something resembling the trench warfare of a previous generation, and both sides spent their nights probing each other's weaknesses in the dark. 8 men, a sergeant leading them, a machine gun team, a couple of riflemen. Standard composition for a combat patrol operating in the no-man's land between the American main line of resistance and the forward positions held by the Chinese People's Volunteer Army. Their mission was simple in concept and brutally dangerous in execution. Move out. Gather intelligence on enemy movement. Return before dawn. Do not make contact if avoidable. The last part of that order became irrelevant very quickly. To understand what happened that night, you have to understand the landscape. The Korean peninsula in winter is a place of savage, unforgiving terrain. The mountains are not gentle, rolling hills. They are steep, jagged ridges with sharp drops into narrow valleys, covered in scrub brush and frozen earth that makes every step a negotiation between traction and the void. The valleys funnel wind in ways that can drop a man's effective temperature into ranges where survival is measured in minutes without shelter. The ridges offer observation, but no protection. And in between, the low ground between positions, there are draws and gullies and folds in the earth that can hide 100 men until they are close enough to touch you. The Chinese commanders understood this terrain intimately. They had been operating in it for months by this point in the war. They knew where American patrols liked to move. They knew the natural corridors that men in the dark tended to gravitate toward. They knew the psychology of soldiers moving through unfamiliar ground at night, how they cluster to terrain features for comfort and navigation, how they bunch up in tight spots, how they instinctively orient toward the high ground. And they used all of that knowledge to build their ambushes with a precision that was, in its own terrible way, a form of military craftsmanship. The patrol moved out from the American lines at approximately 2200 hours. The sergeant checked his men before they stepped off the wire. He looked at each face in the dim light, checked their weapons, made sure the machine gun team had their ammunition properly distributed, that the belts were not going to foul in the cold, that the gun itself had been given its pre-mission treatment. The bolt worked back and forth manually to keep the action from stiffening. They had heated the oil with their body warmth as best they could. They had wrapped what they could in rags. But there is only so much preparation a man can do against 30 below. The gun would work when it needed to, or it would not. That was the reality of the equipment situation in that war, in that winter, on that peninsula. And the sergeant understood it, and he moved his men out anyway, because that was the mission, and the mission was what you did. The first 15 minutes of any patrol are the worst for the nerves. Your eyes are still adjusting from the relative light of the friendly position to the absolute darkness of no man's land. Every sound is magnified into something potentially lethal. The crunch of a boot on frozen ground sounds like a gunshot. The rustle of a man's jacket against a bush sounds like something moving in the darkness ahead. The patrol moved slowly. They used hand signals. They kept intervals. They breathed through their mouths to reduce the visible vapor clouds that could betray a position in cold air. Though in this temperature, every breath produced a small ghost of steam regardless. The sergeant was navigating by landmarks he had memorized from a map study done in a warm bunker that afternoon, trying to reconcile the flat abstraction of a topographic map with the three-dimensional reality of moving through broken terrain at night, with 8 men who were cold and tired and trying very hard not to make any noise. They had been out for approximately 40 minutes when the sergeant noticed something that did not fit, a silence in the landscape that was too complete. In his experience, even a freezing Korean hillside at midnight had sounds. Wind through brush, the distant bark of artillery, the occasional crack of a single rifle shot from some other sector where someone's nerves had gotten the better of them. But in the depression they were moving through, a shallow bowl in the terrain maybe 60 meters across, there was nothing. No wind, no sound, not even the small animal movements that normally populated the darkness. The patrol had walked into the silence that precedes an ambush. He knew it. He felt it in the way experienced soldiers feel things, through some accumulation of pattern recognition that the conscious mind cannot always articulate, but that the body translates into an immediate physical alarm. He was reaching for his radio handset to call back a warning to the main line of resistance when the night fell apart. The bugles started first. That is always how people describe Chinese ambushes in the Korean War. The bugles. Not because the Chinese used them as a military instrument in the way a cavalry unit might have in an earlier century to coordinate complex maneuver. They used them as a psychological weapon, to disorient, to frighten, to fill the darkness with a sound that has no comfortable military reference point for an American soldier. It is a wailing, discordant sound when you hear it from multiple directions simultaneously, when you cannot locate any single source, when it seems to be coming from the ground itself, and from the sky above, and from the brush on your left, and the ridgeline on your right, all at the same time. And then the Chinese infantry rose from the ground, where they had been lying prone and still in temperatures that should have been unbearable, having held their positions for potentially hours in advance of the patrol's arrival, and they came forward. 82 men. That was the number established later through a combination of post-action reporting, enemy documents captured in subsequent operations, and the physical evidence left on the ground when daylight came. 82 Chinese People's Volunteer Army soldiers against a patrol of 8 Americans in a natural bowl in the terrain with no cover, no prepared positions, and weapons that were already fighting the cold as hard as they were about to fight the enemy. The geometry of the ambush was nearly perfect. The Chinese had positioned their forces along 3 sides of the depression, leaving only the direction from which the patrol had entered as a potential avenue of withdrawal, and even that was covered by a blocking element. The sergeant understood immediately, in the fraction of a second between the first bugle note and the first muzzle flash, that if his patrol ran, they would be shot in the back before they covered 20 meters. The only viable option, the only option that gave any of his men any chance at all, was to fight from exactly where they were, and to make the fight so violent and so immediate that the Chinese could not consolidate their assault. He screamed for his machine gunner. One word, one name. The order did not need elaboration. Every man in that patrol had trained for this scenario. The machine gun was the center of gravity. Everything else was secondary. The machine gunner was already moving, already dropping into the lowest available ground, which was not much, maybe a depression in the frost-hardened earth that put him 6 inches lower than the surrounding terrain. But 6 inches is the difference between a bullet through the skull and a bullet through the air above a skull. And in combat, 6 inches matters enormously. His assistant gunner dropped beside him, pulling ammunition from the carrying bag, locking a belt into the feed tray with hands that were shaking from cold and adrenaline in equal measure. The gunner acquired the muzzle flashes on his dominant flank, laid his sights on the center mass of the advancing line, and pressed the trigger. The gun fired. In that moment, in that specific configuration of desperation and cold and overwhelming odds, the fact that it fired at all was a kind of miracle. The barrel lit up the depression with its first long burst, a sustained 4-second burst that swept left to right across the advancing line on his left flank, and the sound of it in that enclosed terrain was enormous, concussive. The kind of sound that physically rattles the chest cavity and momentarily overrides all other sensory input. Men went down in the first burst. Not enough. Not nearly enough. There were too many of them, and they were already too close, and they were not stopping. The Chinese infantry in that period of the war had been conditioned to absorb casualties and continue forward. This was not a criticism of their courage. It was a statement about their training, their doctrine, and their understanding of the tactical situation. If they stopped moving under fire in the open, they died. If they continued moving, some of them would reach the American position, and if enough of them reached it, the position would be overrun. Forward was the only calculation that made tactical sense from their perspective, and they had committed to it before the first shot was fired. The sergeant was shooting with his carbine, short bursts, controlled. He was trying to track the closest threats and keep the immediate perimeter clear enough that his men could keep functioning. 2 of his riflemen had gone left, trying to anchor that flank. 2 had gone right. The remaining man, his radio operator, was behind him, shouting their position into the handset, calling for fire support, calling for anything, the words coming out in that particular controlled urgency that men develop under fire, fast and precise and stripped of everything that is not essential information. Grid coordinates, contact report, enemy in the open, requesting immediate fire support. The voice of a man who knows that the words he is speaking may be the last useful thing he ever does and is determined to get them exactly right. The machine gun kept firing. The gunner was working the traversing mechanism, sweeping the gun back and forth, engaging targets as they appeared, burning through ammunition at a rate that was already becoming a problem. The assistant gunner was managing the feed tray, watching for jams, keeping the belt indexed properly, reaching over to clear the occasional stoppage with the practiced movement of a man who had done it in training so many times that the procedure was available to him even now, even with the world ending around him, even with the cold and the noise and the muzzle flashes and the Chinese infantry closing from 3 sides. He cleared the first stoppage in approximately 4 seconds. 4 seconds during which the gun was silent, during which the advancing line had closed another several meters, during which the geometry of survival had tightened another degree. The barrel was getting hot. This is a mechanical inevitability with sustained automatic fire, but in these specific conditions it took on a particular significance. The barrel of a machine gun in sustained fire reaches temperatures that can exceed 600 degrees Celsius at the exterior surface near the muzzle. In normal conditions, this heat dissipates into the ambient air, but the gun the patrol was using was equipped with a spare barrel for exactly this contingency, the standard practice being to swap barrels when the primary overheated rather than allow the heat to cause a cook-off or warp the metal to the point of malfunction. The problem was the spare barrel. It had been secured to the gun's tripod with the standard locking mechanism. But the cold had worked on that mechanism in the hours since the patrol had left the wire. The metal had contracted. The locking catch had stiffened. The assistant gunner attempted the barrel change at approximately the 8-minute mark of the engagement and could not execute it. The locking mechanism would not release. He tried again. It held. He tried a 3rd time, putting both hands on it, putting his full grip strength into it, and felt it begin to move but not complete the rotation. The primary barrel was now glowing faintly at the muzzle in the darkness. Faintly, but visibly. The heat was migrating back toward the receiver. The gunner had not stopped firing. He could feel the heat through the gun's bipod legs where his left hand was braced. He could feel it through the pistol grip. He adjusted his grip, tried to minimize contact with the surfaces that were conducting the most heat, and kept firing because stopping meant dying, because the Chinese were close enough now that he could hear individual voices in the noise of the assault, could see individual faces illuminated in the muzzle flash. And because the gun was still functioning, and while the gun was still functioning, there was still the possibility that this ended with some of them alive. The first Chinese soldiers reached the edge of the patrol's improvised perimeter. The riflemen on the flanks were engaged in point-blank firefights that had devolved in some cases to individual combat at distances of less than 5 meters. One of the riflemen on the left went down, hit in the shoulder, and the man beside him stepped over him and continued to fire. The sergeant had stopped using his carbine and had his bayonet fixed, which tells you something about the distances involved, about the compression of this fight into something that no longer resembled the formal geometry of a firefight and had become something older and more primitive. He was screaming at his men, specific instructions, not encouragement, not the kind of words you see in movies, just tactical information, the location of threats, the direction of the next wave, the status of the ammunition, delivered in the clipped, profane vocabulary of a sergeant managing chaos in the only way it can be managed, which is one immediate problem at a time. The machine gun continued to fire. The barrel's heat was now significant enough that the gunner could no longer touch the gun's forward surfaces without immediate pain. His right hand on the pistol grip was insulated by his glove, but his glove was thinning from the heat conducted through the metal. His left hand, which was steadying the gun from the bipod mounting point, was in direct contact with a surface that was transmitting enough heat to begin damaging tissue through the insulation. He knew this. He could feel it. He kept firing. The calculus he had made was simple, and it was not even really a conscious decision at this point. The gun stops. The position is overrun. The position is overrun. Everyone dies. While there was ammunition, and while the gun was functioning, the gun would fire. Whatever the cost to his hands was a secondary variable in that equation. The radio operator had gotten through to the artillery. The call for fire had been received and was being processed, which in the language of fire missions means that someone in a warm fire direction center several kilometers to the rear was doing the mathematics of ballistics and safety distances and translating a grid coordinate into gun data and passing that data to a battery that was rotating tubes and adjusting elevation and preparing to drop high explosive rounds into the darkness at a specific point on the map. This process takes time. It takes less time than most people think, but it takes more time than the men in that depression had. The radio operator adjusted his request. He told the fire direction center that the patrol was in direct contact, that the enemy was in the wire, that he needed the rounds as close as possible. He gave them the most current grid. He told them to fire for effect without adjustment, understanding that this was a request that could as easily kill the patrol as save it, and making that request anyway because the alternative was certainly worse. The assistant gunner finally cleared the barrel change. He had used his body heat, pressing the locking mechanism against his torso for approximately 90 seconds while maintaining enough situational awareness to keep loading belts into the feed tray, and the warmth from his core had been enough to bring the metal back into a range where the mechanism would function. He released the barrel in a single motion and had the new barrel locked in place in under 10 seconds. The glowing primary barrel dropped to the frozen ground where it sat steaming in the cold air, melting a small patch of frost around itself. The gun's rate of fire immediately improved. The new barrel was cold, mechanically tighter, and the first burst from it had the crisp, full-velocity sound of a properly functional weapon, rather than the slightly degraded sound that had been developing in the final minutes of the primary barrel's service life. The Chinese assault had not stopped. If anything, it had intensified in the moments when the gun changed barrels, as if some of the attacking force had recognized the pause and committed their reserves to exploiting it. The wave coming from the north side of the depression was within 15 meters of the patrol's position. The sergeant had physically engaged 2 men in the last minute, not as metaphor, not as literary device, but as literal physical reality. A man closing to arm's reach in the dark, and the sergeant responding with whatever was available, and what was available was the bayonet, and then the butt of the carbine, and then For a moment, that he would not discuss in any available account of the engagement, just his hands. The left flank rifleman who had been shot was back on his feet, using his good arm, using his rifle as a club when the ammunition in his magazine ran out because he did not have a free hand to reload. The artillery came in. The first round was close, dangerously close. The crack and concussion of it was different from the ongoing firefight, louder in a qualitative way that penetrated through the sustained noise of the engagement and registered in the back of the brain as something requiring immediate attention. Dirt and frozen earth rained down on the patrol. The radio operator was already on the handset making a correction, adjusting the impact point slightly north, adding a request for continuous fire for effect. His voice still controlled, still carrying the specific cadence of professional work under impossible conditions. The second round landed where the first adjustment had directed it, and then the battery opened up and the depression became a place where the laws of survival were being renegotiated in real time. The Chinese assault broke. Not all at once, not cleanly. It frayed first at the edges, where the soldiers furthest from their objective and closest to the artillery impacts made the rational decision to withdraw rather than continue forward into a beaten zone. The fraying spread inward. The bugle sounded again, a different pattern this time, the withdrawal signal, and the pressure on the patrol's perimeter eased from the flanks first, and then from the front. There were still men close. There were still exchanges of fire, but the organized assault, the coordinated pressure from three sides that had been the structural threat to the patrol's survival, had dissolved. The patrol's position was no longer being systematically consumed. It was being harassed, which is a very different thing. The machine gunner was still firing. He was firing at specific targets now, at the shapes of men visible in the flashes of the artillery impacts, methodically working left to right across his sector the way he had been trained. His hands had been on that gun through the entirety of the engagement. The grip surfaces had been hot enough for long enough that the damage to his palms and fingers was significant. The extent of it would not become fully apparent until the adrenaline wore off and the numbness that had been keeping him functional for the last several minutes ceased to provide its blunted protection. But he was firing. He was still firing. The gun was working and he was behind it. And whatever was happening to his hands was a problem for later, for the aid station, for the surgeon, for the months of recovery that would follow. Right now there were still targets. The sergeant was reorganizing his perimeter, counting men, finding the wounded. The rifleman who had taken the shoulder hit was functional but losing blood. Another man had a fragment wound from one of the artillery impacts, a piece of his own side's ammunition, the particular irony of close support fire. The sergeant was moving between them, checking the severity, making rapid triage assessments, the same mental calculus of battlefield medicine that every combat sergeant develops out of necessity. He was also watching the darkness for signs of a reorganized attack. The Chinese were good at this. They were capable of withdrawing, reorganizing, and coming back. The sergeant had seen it happen. The patrol was not safe. The patrol would not be safe until it was back behind the wire. He gave the order to withdraw. It was the right call, and he made it the moment the immediate pressure allowed it. He designated his machine gun as the rearguard element, the last to move, covering the withdrawal of the rest of the patrol. He sent his rifleman and the radio operator back toward the main line of resistance, following the route they had come in on, moving fast, moving carefully. The wounded man supported between two of his comrades, with one hand, each still holding weapons. The sergeant moved with them for 100 meters and then stopped and turned and waited for his machine gun team to break contact and follow. The gunner and his assistant came back through the patrol's position in a controlled bound, the assistant gunner moving first while the gunner covered, then the gunner moving while the assistant covered, the two of them executing the movement as they had been trained to do it, maintaining a base of fire through the entire withdrawal sequence. The gun was still hot. The gunner's hands were still on it. He was carrying the gun by its bipod and its barrel grip in a way that minimized direct contact with the hottest surfaces, but minimizing direct contact was not the same as eliminating it. He was running now, as fast as a man can run on frozen terrain in the dark, with 40 pounds of weapons and ammunition and the specific physical cost of an engagement that had lasted somewhere in the range of 20 to 25 minutes, which is an eternity in infantry combat. They came through the wire at approximately 15 hours. The soldiers on the main line of resistance had been following the engagement on the radio, had heard the fire mission, had seen the muzzle flashes and the artillery impacts in the darkness out in no man's land, and they were waiting. They pulled the patrol in through a gap in the wire, and the sergeant reported his contact immediately, standing in the cold, outside the command bunker with blood from a cut on his face he had not noticed getting, his carbine still in his hand, giving his after-action report in the methodical voice of a man who has processed the adrenaline of the last half hour into something functional. The machine gunner was taken to the aid station. The battalion surgeon examined his hands. The damage to his palms was assessed as second and third degree thermal burns, covering approximately 40% of the surface area of both hands. The tissue had been damaged not from a single moment of contact with the barrel or the receiver surfaces, but from cumulative exposure to conducted heat over the duration of the sustained engagement, the way a low but continuous heat source is capable of causing more profound damage than a brief high-temperature contact, because the body cannot protect itself through reflex withdrawal when the alternative to maintaining contact is immediate death. The burns had been somewhat masked by the cold during the engagement itself, the numbness of the fingers and palms providing a partial analgesic effect that had allowed the gunner to continue firing past the point where the pain would have been incapacitating under normal temperature conditions. The cold that had been trying to kill him for the entire operation had, in one specific and deeply ironic way, also been the thing that kept him behind the gun long enough to do what needed doing. The after-action count of the engagement identified 14 Chinese soldiers killed in the impact area of the patrol's position and the immediate surrounding terrain. The artillery fire accounted for an additional number that could not be precisely determined from ground evidence. 3 of the 8 patrol members were wounded, none fatally. The patrol's primary mission, intelligence gathering on Chinese movement patterns in that sector, had not been completed. A subsequent patrol, sent 2 nights later with a modified rote and reinforced strength, found evidence that the Chinese force that had conducted the ambush had withdrawn from their forward positions in the days following the engagement, likely in response to the artillery fire's effect on their staging areas. The sergeant received a silver star. The radio operator received a bronze star with valor device. The machine gunner was evacuated to a field hospital and subsequently to a general hospital in Japan, where he underwent multiple surgical procedures on both hands over a period of approximately 6 weeks. The medical records indicated that he retained functional use of both hands following his recovery. He did not return to Korea. The war continued for another 22 months after the night of that patrol, grinding forward and backward across a peninsula that was cold in winter and hot in summer, and violent in all seasons, until an armistice was signed in July of 1953 that left the boundary between North and South Korea approximately where it had been when the fighting started 3 years earlier. The 8 men of that patrol had held a position against 82 attacking soldiers in 31 below zero in the dark for 23 minutes and had all come back through the wire alive. That is the complete statement of what happened.